Our speaker, my good colleague and good friend Nurul Huda Razif today to you, and I would like to tell you a bit about her background and about her academic trajectory also before we get into the topic. The title of the talk will be Enemies from Within, Love Magic, Sorcery, and Intra-female Violence Among Co-Wives in Malay Polygyny. Now, as you know, at our Center for Advanced Studies, we try to look at esoteric practices from a global perspective. And we've been discussing a bit what a global perspective can or should mean. And of course, there are different understandings of that. For some people, it might just be that there are certain individuals sitting at a certain location, let's say in Germany, thinking about what the global condition might be. Yeah, so it might be just a few, to put it a bit bluntly, a few white guys philosophizing about the global condition. Another approach would be to put together, people from different parts of the world, different experiences, trajectories, to approximate, maybe to come close to what could be considered a global perspective. And yet another mode of a global perspective is a very rare one, and I think it's a very rare species of scholars who actually can represent it. And Nurul Huda belongs to that species, if I may say, because sometimes people really embody that global perspective. So Nurul Huda grew up in various parts of the world, including in Western Africa, in Guinea, in Ghana, but also in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, so in South Asia, and of course in her country of birth, Malaysia. So she was basically growing up in 3 different continents. For her undergrad studies, she went to Australia to study French. So she's, how is that called, Francophile? Or very much, has lived in Paris also for quite some time, speaks fluent French, studied French, but then decided to move on to anthropology at the University of Cambridge and did 2 years of fieldwork in Malaysia and Thailand and completed her PhD in Cambridge in anthropology at the age of 26. And since doing that, she has held fellowships at Harvard University, at the EHESS, and by the way, at the KC of Paris, which is the Center for Southeast Asia as well, at Leiden University, there at the KITLB Center, but also at the IIS, the International Institute for Asian Studies, and held a Japanese fellowship from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, a postdoc fellowship in Kyoto for some time in Japan. And now she just moved to Norway. So that's what I mean by embodying a global perspective. I'm not sure whether you followed the amount of countries that I just mentioned. And so she's now a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Bergen in Norway, working on her project, which is called Malay Matrimony. And I think she will give us a bit of a sense of what she's working on. But today, she also agreed to center on that aspect of love magic, which is very much at the heart of what Casey here is interested in. And we had discussions about that topic before, I think several years ago in Halle at the Max Planck Institute already, because if I remember it right, it was something that was just always there. Although when Nurul for her PhD studied polygamous marriages and the life situation of people living in them and people like marrying across the border in Thailand, going back to Malaysia and kind of negotiating that situation, that love magic subject had always been part of the story, even without looking for it. And so I'm very glad that today she will center on that and will tell us about her insights into that subject. So I'm really very pleased to have you back in Erlangen, actually, I think for the 3rd time now, but for the first time at Casey. Yeah. And Nurul Huda, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for that colorful introduction, and of course for the invitation to return to Erlangen. Thank you, everyone, for coming here this afternoon, taking the time to hear about love magic and sorcery and Malay polygamy, which I hope it's not what you usually hear about. So as Dominic mentioned, I'm now based in Bergen, actually in the Department of Foreign Languages, even though I'm a social anthropologist by training. But currently I'm working on a project called Malay Matrimony, which looks at the division of matrimonial wealth in Malay polygamy in Malaysian Sharia courts. And that is a serious issue because, as I will also mention in this presentation, economic competition for resources in Malay polygamous families, lead to very drastic consequences in terms of kinship, family dynamics. So I hope to go into more detail into that. But today I'm looking more into the relationship between love magic, sorcery, and intra-female violence in Malay polygamy. And I'll start very briefly by explaining where I've done fieldwork and what I've been doing in my fieldwork. So my main period of fieldwork was between the years of 2014 to 2015, with, of course, subsequent return visits to Malaysia, and southern Thailand, where I started by studying cross-border marriages in Songkhla, which is in the northern part of this map. And so I was studying Malay polygamous couples who elope to get married there to evade various bureaucratic restrictions on polygamy in Malaysian Sharia courts, which I will explain a little bit more. And then I followed these couples to Kelantan, Kota Baru, just at the Malaysian-Thai border, and went through the process of registering these marriages in the Sharia courts, which is itself, a very complicated process, but it revealed a lot about the bureaucratization of Islam processes that were happening in Malaysia at that time, especially the bureaucratization of Muslim marriages, especially polygamy. And then I also did a comparative kind of fieldwork in the Islamic courts in Kuala Lumpur, where I looked at the same marriage registration processes and polygamy applications, which revealed very different processes, even though they were all happening within Malaysia, but different procedures were put in place. And in the last few months of my fieldwork, I lived with a polygamous family in Negeri Sembilan, which is about an hour's drive away from Kuala Lumpur. And this is where the bulk of the data that I'll be presenting today came from living with the first family of a polygamous family, of a polygamous marriage, and the everyday dynamics and the stories that I hear from the first wife there. So here is the plan for today. First, I'll just introduce Malaysia very briefly, because I realize maybe not a lot of you are familiar with Malaysia or Southeast Asia. And then I'll talk about Malay polygyny in the Islamic family law. And just a quick note on that, I use the word polygyny and polygamy interchangeably in this context, because there is only one kind of polygamy that is allowed in Malaysia legally, which is polygyny, one man marrying multiple wives. Polyandry is not recognized at all in Islam or in Islamic family law. So, and there's very few cases of it being practiced, or none that I've heard of. So I use it interchangeably, just for clarity. And then I'll also talk about Malay polygyny, structure of it, and the house, and who lives in it, the division of resources, how does that work out? And then I'll talk about stories of love magic and sorcery that I hear, and how that can be interpreted as a manifestation of intra-female violence. And I'll end with some concluding thoughts. So Malaysia has a population of about 34.3 million people, and Islam is the official religion, although we have a dual legal system, the civil and Sharia legal system, the civil law being very much something we inherited from British common law, and Sharia is more, it's very complicated, but it's mostly based on Islamic law. But we are a very multicultural and multi-religious society. Islam constitutes the bulk majority of the population, with 63% of the people practicing Islam, about 18% practicing Buddhism, 9% Christianity, Hindu is about 6%, and others following animist religion. And the majority of Malaysians are also categorized as Bumi Putra, which means the sons of the soil. And this includes the Malays, who are considered sort of indigenous people, and also the other indigenous groups of Malaysia called the Orang Asli. So and those are much smaller compared to the Malays, but they're all categorized under Bumi Putra as indigenous to Malaysia. And there's about 20% of Chinese in our population, and 6% Indian, and others, including non-citizens, who are about 10%. So mostly migrant workers from South Asia or Cambodia and Nepal and all. So to talk about polygyny, like statistically, it's not as high as in the African context, for example, like Senegal here has about 40% of polygamy. But in Malaysia, it's really hard to get one number of like how much polygamy is, and to actually rate how much it's increasing year by year, because a lot of polygamous marriages are not officially registered or or done through the court. So we look at the numbers that I've presented here, looking at one state in Malaysia, Selangor. There were about 859 cases of polygamy applications between 2019 to 2022, but the number of polygamy cross-border marriage registrations are about double that amount. So when I say polygamy cross-border marriages, it means couples who went to Thailand to get married and then they came back to Malaysia to register these marriages. So and this number is probably only 1/3 of what the actual number is. So it's really hard to measure how much polygamy is, also because of how volatile many of these marriages are. So a lot of them end in divorce before they can even be registered. So, but the fact that polygamy is legal and possible for Muslim men is in itself a politically strong incentive for a lot of Islamist conservative Muslims to kind of defend this right to practice polygamy, despite the many social problems that are happening with it, as we know. So in the Islamic family law, there is a section that allows polygyny for men, but it's very conditional, which means that the applicant or the husband has to apply for permission from the Sharia judge to marry his second, third, or fourth wife. So the maximum number is 4 at one time. And he has to fulfill these conditions. First, he has to show that the proposed marriage is just or necessary. So which means that he has to show that the first wife has problems like sterility, physical infirmity, physical unfitness for conjugal relations, willful avoidance of an order for restitution of conjugal rights, or insanity. He has to show that that he is able to accord fair treatment to all his wives as required by Islamic law. But of course, this is a very vague condition. Like how do you measure this? And then the applicant has to show that he has such means as to enable him to support all his wives and dependents, including persons who would be his dependents as a result of the proposed marriage. So the future second wife and any children she may have from the previous marriages. He has to show that the proposed marriage would not cause darar shari to the existing wife. And this means harm with respect to her religion, life, body, mind, or property. In the 1980s, they also included another condition, which is that the proposed marriage will not directly or indirectly lower the standard of living of existing wives and dependents, especially that they had been enjoying and would reasonably expect to continue to enjoy were the marriage not to take place. In 2002, they removed this condition, which means that men are not held accountable to ensure that they maintain the same standard of living to the existing family. And this has been heavily criticized by Muslim rights groups because it shows that there are less financial conditions for practicing polygamy. I should also mention that because of these conditions, a lot of men are actually unable to show that they are financially able to support multiple families. So a lot of them know that their application for polygamy would be rejected, so they simply don't bother to apply through the Sharia court, and they just simply go to Thailand, get married in one day, come back to Malaysia, and pay maybe 100 euros in fines and have a legal polygamous marriage. So there is a legal loophole to this is all for show. And I've written extensively about cross-border marriage, democratization of Islam, how does that affect, how does that promote unregulated practices of polygamy, but that's a topic for a different talk. So let's get into the heart of what Malay polygamy looks like. So why do men practice polygamy? According to a Danish anthropologist who's worked extensively on Malay elite polygamy in Malaysia, called Miriam Zeitzen, she notices that the Malay elite, especially in the 80s and 90s, practiced polygamy for more symbolic reasons. And the first of that is that shows that Malay upper middle class men are able to practice something that is traditionally associated with the aristocratic elite. So in the past, only sultans and like noble men were able to practice polygamy because they have the means to do it and not because of the status and prestige. Polygamy is also a symbol of wealth. A lot of men practice it as an act of conspicuous consumption and proof of their affluence and their ability to support multiple wives. And among Malay elite men, they kind of compete on who can get the younger wife and who can get second wife who's Chinese or who's even European, so it's really like a competition who can get the better second wife. It's also a symbol of Islamic piety because the Prophet, peace be upon him, was polygamous. And in the 1980s, Malaysia went through a wave of Islamic revivalism in which to show that you are a pious Muslim would gain you prestige and respect in society. So to show that you are following a prophetic practice shows that you are a very, very good Muslim compared to the other Muslim brothers. And then finally, it highlights or it emphasizes the Malay Muslim identity of these men practicing polygamy, because in 1982, polygamy was outlawed for non-Muslims under civil marriage laws. So even though Chinese and Indian men were polygamous in the sense that they had multiple wives or concubines who were recognized as their legal spouses, this was no longer possible for them after 1982, which meant that polygamy was specifically, it became the privilege of only Muslim men who were mostly Malays. So what are their motivations for polygamy? So this, according to the polygamy applications that I read in several Sharia courts in Malaysia, this is what they say. So I'm kind of condensing hundreds of applications into one slide. But the main reason is usually for love and attraction. So one applicant said, for romantic love, mutual attraction, we have come to know each other's hearts. And he also, another applicant said, I love my future wife and her child too much to the point where I would protect them. And marriage is one way to do that. And then a lot of men also mentioned that they would like to practice polygamy to avoid committing sin. And they said that they want to halalize, which means to render halal or permissible what has been decreed haram or forbidden by Allah. So this is referring to romantic relationships that could get sexual, which is sinful, considered sinful in Islam. And another applicant said they want to prevent from committing acts of vice, maksiat, such as zina, which means sexual fornication. So it's a combination of romantic and also moral, ethical, religious reasons. And this also has to be read in the context of Malaysia's very strict moral policing laws on Muslims. So we have under the Sharia criminal law, a specific section on sexual offenses, which includes, being in illicit proximity to a member of the opposite sex, committing extramarital sexual relations, and all this, which are all punishable by a fine or jail time. But every state has a Department of Religious Affairs, and they deploy a moral policing unit that kind of goes out and, makes sure everyone stays in line. So that's a kind of like surveillance of intimacy that I had also been looking at in one aspect of my work. So this is one of the reasons why there's a lot of pressure to marry instead of just continuing many of these relationships as extramarital relationships. And from the women's side, there are different motivations for it. So a lot of women's side wanting to secure love, companionship, and sexual intimacy. A lot of them have claimed to have fallen in love with a married man, and marriage is the only way to be sexually intimate or close to the person. Motherhood is also a major reason for deciding to marry as a second wife. So Malay womanhood is defined by a woman's reproductive capacity. If you are married, but you don't have children, you're still not fully evolved as a woman yet. And women can only have children within marriage. So there's a tremendous pressure for women to marry in order to become mothers. And also a lot of women marry for economic security. So they marry to get a man's economic support after having gone through a divorce. So for these reasons, a lot of women have decided that it is acceptable to marry as a second wife, even though they know that they would face various sanctions from society for doing so. But these are usually the reasons that they consent to marrying into polygamy. So now I want to look into the idea of the house in polygamy, and I'm drawing here on literature on anthropology of the house that has been looking at what does the house represent for a particular society. And I'd like to think about Malay polygyny through the lens of the house as a physical unit of production and reproduction. I want to make the case that the house is such an important aspect of Malay polygyny because the multilocal nature of Malay polygyny is so crucial in producing particular kinds of relations, kinship relations, and flows of resources that reproduce much of the divisive aspects of Malay polygamy. So earlier anthropologists studying the house tended to consider the house in symbolic terms. Levi-Strauss was one of the first anthropologists to study house societies, looking at the noble houses in medieval Europe as consisting of tangible properties on the one hand, but also as a vessel for transmitting intangible wealth from generation to generation. These noble houses endure through the inheritance of family titles, status, prestige, all of which are transferred through kinship and marriage alliances. I'm also drawing here on the work of Diane Lyons, who is an ethnoarchaeologist studying the Dela people in northern Cameroon, who observed that the family compounds reflect Dela worldviews on gender, property, and kinship so clearly in the physical layout of their living spaces. So the Dela practice polygyny as well, and co-wives typically live in the same compound. And as the man marries additional wives, new wings or living quarters consisting of a bedroom and a kitchen are added adjacent to the first wife's living quarters. So it continues to expand over the man's life. But there is also a specific cultural logic to how a Dela house is set up. And this is what Lyons writes. She says, spaces have cultural values. Men conduct most of their daily activities in or outside the entry structure where they sleep, have sex with their wives, eat and drink beer with sons and male guests. Women give birth, sleep, and eat with their young children, prepare food and beer, make pottery and other objects, drink beer and entertain female guests in the kitchen and bedroom at the back. Men literally conduct their activities in positions that are above and in front of those of women, reproducing the perception of their social and economic superiority. So the organization of the living space in the Dela home not only shows the division of labor within the family structure, but also the gendered hierarchy within that domestic order. Although men are at the top of that order and are also the ones who own and inherit properties from their fathers, this makes them vulnerable to attacks of witchcraft from their wives. So men typically bury a protection amulet in the floor of their house to protect them from their own wives. And suspicions of witchcraft are typically sufficient reason for a man to divorce a wife. In this context, women are seen as impermanent and transient members of the household, and what Lyons calls intimate strangers. They come and go, sometimes with malicious intent, but a man will stay in that house. So the Malay house is not so different from the Dela. Although Malays don't strictly observe gender segregation at home, women tend to gravitate towards the back of the house where the kitchen or the hearth is. And while men normally stay at the forefront of it and they receive guests and rarely do they participate in the production of food and the rituals of commensality, the preparation for the rituals of commensality at the back. What is different, however, is that Malay co-wives never lived in the same house or the same compound, as is common for a lot of African polygamous families. In fact, it is considered cruel of the man to make co-wives live together, as it is an established fact among Malays that co-wives would never find the other's presence tolerable. It also reflects badly on the husband himself, who would be seen as too poor to afford separate living quarters for each of their wives and her children. So the structure of Malay polygamy is succinctly described by Rosemary Firth, an anthropologist of Malaysia in the 50s, who said that Malay polygyny essentially exists as a set of individual unions with the man as the common partner in each. Indeed, Malay polygamy has virtually little resonance with African polygamy because of these three main characteristics. First, families do not live together. And second, they don't know of or about each other. So a lot of second families are kept secret, at least for the first few years of that marriage. And the feasibility of marrying the second wife in Thailand kind of is complicit in keeping that secrecy. And thirdly, polygamous marriages, families exist in competition with one another, and they don't share resources between them, even if they depend on the same source of economic support, that is the husband and the father. In Malay polygamy, the house represents a safe haven for the wife and her children and establishes a kinship unit that is almost matrilineal in nature. Children always ally with their biological mothers, especially in cases of inheritance disputes among polygamous families. Children live with their mother under one roof, while the husband-father is a transient member of the household who shuttles between his families, who are usually in different cities. This presents a significant strain on him, physically, emotionally, and also financially, and becomes more and more difficult to endure the older he gets. One polygamous husband who maintained 2 wives in the Kuala Lumpur metropolitan region for over 30 years complained to me about the horrors of driving, commuting, and shuttling between his 2 families who lived an hour and a half apart. For various reasons relating to his tumultuous experience in polygamy, he regretted his decision to take a second wife, but the logistical nightmare of maintaining 2 families living so far apart was definitely one of them. And he told me in our interview, I think I could die in between my travels. So it is definitely something that is very hard for men to continue. It's not sustainable over the long term. But the house is fundamental for creating family and marital stability in Malay polygamy. I remember a first wife telling me the story of when she first found out about her husband taking another wife. She said she felt so hurt, betrayed, and frustrated, especially after giving up her career to raise 4 children in their 25-year marriage. And her first instinct after she heard the news was to pack up her bags and leave the house with her children. But then she consulted a Sharia, an Islamic lawyer, who told her on their phone consultation, "Ma'am, you need to calm down. First, you must think about where you and your children will live. Where will you go?" And seeing some sense in this comment, she stayed on in the polygamous marriage long enough to transfer the ownership of the family home to their children's name. Over time, her husband stopped, I'd say about over a period of maybe 1 year or 2 years, which is not long in polygamy terms. Her husband stopped returning to their conjugal home, and she understood that he had made his choice between the 2 of them, and that their marriage had ended practically, and divorce would only make the separation official. But she was able to stay on and living in that house with her children, and that created a sense of a secure exit for her out of that polygamous marriage, because she didn't have to leave the house. It was the husband father who just stopped coming there. So unlike the Dela people in Cameroon that I discussed earlier, in Malay polygamy, it is women who are anchored to the house, while men transition towards becoming impermanent members of the family and household through their polygamy. Women may end up establishing more psychological stability in polygamy over time compared to men, because they and their children stay rooted in a physical home and can choose to maintain some distance from the other family. The multilocal setup of Malay polygamy is reinforced by Islamic family law. When a man applies for permission to marry a second wife in the Sharia court, the husband must divide the matrimonial wealth he has accumulated with the first wife over the course of their marriage. One of the most important points of contention is where will the first and second wives live, and who gets to keep the house. The first wife will usually negotiate to keep their conjugal home so that she and her children can continue to live in it. The couple may even agree to transfer the house to their children's name so that the house goes to neither of them, but to their children. This emphasizes even more the exclusionary nature of polygamy, in the sense that the new family is excluded from the existing family's home and their household. And the husband would literally have to set up a new branch elsewhere, as the saying goes. So in Malay, another way of saying a man wants to be polygamous is he's setting up a new branch, buka cawangan baru. And this is especially meant in the logistical sense. He has to set up another house somewhere else. So the house therefore excludes as much as it includes kin-based members of the family. Co-families never visit each other's homes, and the polygamous wives I interviewed who knew about their co-wives never have any desire to do so. This is partly out of suspicion that they will be attacked with some kind of sorcery if they confront their co-wife face to face. And confronting them on their turf would be akin to entering enemy territory in a sense. So another reason for this is to avoid jealousy. Seeing what the other family has will raise suspicions that the husband or father has been spoiling one family more than the other, which will exacerbate tense relations between families. So second families are seen as more prone to harboring jealousy towards their first families because the husband and the first wife have usually over the course of a decade or two, been able to establish a comfortable middle-class life that is the envy of many. Usually they have a big house, a car or two, and they have children who go to university. And this jealousy can manifest in both subtle and sometimes borderline criminal actions. So I want to return to the story of the first wife who consulted the Sharia lawyer about the house I mentioned earlier. Let's call her Aziza. Aziza consulted the lawyer precisely because she did not want their conjugal home to end up in the second wife's hands, and her suspicions almost came true. After she and her husband signed the ownership of the house over to their children, she thought it would remain secure in their hands, as in the hands of her and her children. But one day, while attending to her ailing father in her hometown 3 hours drive away, she had a strange feeling of restlessness that in her heart that told her to go back and check up on the house immediately. She returned to find that the house had been broken into and completely emptied of all its furniture and all its contents. She later found out that the husband had brought the second wife into their home, and both of them, perhaps in retaliation to having lost the house to her, took everything that was in it. The first wife made a police report for robbery, but since the husband was behind this and they were still married at that time, there was no case to be made. The police considered this to be a matter of domestic dispute that was out of their hands. But this act was a bold statement from the second wife, announcing that she was willing to resort to drastic measures to supplant the first wife in the marriage. And if she can't be her, she will appropriate what is hers. The fact that even personal items such as family photo albums, which had no monetary value but tremendous sentimental value to the first family, and these were taken in this heist, shows an erasure of shared memories and family identity, as if to remove the existence of the first family from the husband's life. This is an almost extreme manifestation of the competition for resources between families. But we can see that the competition for resources here is actually not just about resources, but also about the power struggle between co-wives, the need to maximize access to resources when living in scarcity, and also a kind of insecurity in trying to establish one's place in an already established marriage. For these reasons, it is in everyone's interest that all families should live separately, not only geographically, but also in form and function. The result is what I call the siloing of families in polygamy, where families emerge as a distinct household, economic, and kinship unit, with the husband-father as the only common point connecting them. The multilocal structure is especially advantageous for husbands who want to keep the second family secret or to minimize exposure between families, which could produce incendiary reactions. And though families depend on the husband-father as the same economic source, they do not share resources between them, leaving each family to fend for itself. So this means that Malay polygynous marriages are breaking two cardinal rules of Malay kinship. That is cohabitation, the act of living together, and commensality, the act of feeding together. And we know this through Janet Carsten's work on kinship. She introduced this groundbreaking concept of relatedness from her work in the island of Langkawi, which was published in the 90s. And this is the idea, relatedness is the idea that people are not born as kin, but rather they become kin through various social practices, including cohabitation and commensality. She writes that kinship is processual, and I quote her here, "It is through living and consuming together in houses that people become complete persons, that is, kin." Based on Carsten's concept of how Malay kinship is formed, we can argue that polygamy is in fact anti-kinship, because it is structured in a way that creates rupture and division in the family unit. And these ruptures and divisions are both a cause for and a consequence of practices of love magic and sorcery that are commonly heard in Malay polygamous families. And I will turn to this now. Anthropological studies of witchcraft and sorcery have established how these practices rarely occur between strangers who are socially distant, but usually between close kin who are related by blood or marriage. The anthropologist Peter Geschir famously coined the term the dark side of kinship to show how the prevalence of witchcraft among the Maka of Southeast Cameroon creates a deep ambivalence towards kinship as both a source of protection and apprehension. Among the Maka, the Jambe, translated as sorcery or sorcery, is so frightening because it forces people to realize that there is jealousy and aggression in the very bottom of the family. Kinship should be the main basis, not to mention the only one, of trust and solidarity. But the Jambe highlights that this very intimacy is at the same time a deadly danger. What is interesting is that Geshere's study not only shows how witchcraft utterly destroys the myth of kinship as being a safe haven and a social safety net for people, but also how the intensification of Jambe among the Maka can be traced to the widening urban-rural divide and economic inequalities that are a product of modernization in post-colonial Cameroon. And this inspired me to consider how sorcery practices and accusations in the context of Malay polygamy can also be interpreted as a response to broadening economic inequalities in contemporary Malaysia. In the 1970s, Malaysia launched industrialization efforts that created tremendous economic growth and advancement for the country. And it also created a new class of Malay elites. So I mentioned Miriam Zaitun before, and she has extensively studied Malay elites who practice polygamy for the reasons I mentioned earlier, as an act of conspicuous consumption, to flaunt their wealth and to show that they could afford to support multiple families. So in a way, the economic advancement of this period of Malays since the 1980s democratized access to polygamy, making it possible for men who are not of aristocratic lineage to also take on this practice. But the court still made it a reserve of the wealthy elite by implementing proof of financial ability to maintain multiple wives in order to be able to practice polygamy. But one thing has changed over the years, especially since 1994, and this is the feasibility of eloping to Thailand to contract polygamy and register this marriage in the Sharia court. So prior to 1994, this was not recognized as a legal or Islamic marriage. But since then, the Islamic judiciary has opened up a space to recognize these marriages. And these have become more and more elaborate in the judicial practices, which is also one part of my research, looking at the socio-legal aspects of it. But there is a problem with allowing polygamous marriages contracted in Thailand to be registered in Malaysia, because it allows men to evade the financial conditions for polygamy already set by the court. And more importantly, it allows men of limited economic ability to marry multiple wives, even if they cannot support them. And this creates a climate of scarcity, especially when a man who could barely afford to support one family goes on to attempt to support another wife and also her children from previous marriages. And scarcity creates competition that must be eliminated through direct or indirect means, such as sorcery. Indeed, sorcery among co-wives in polygyny is widely documented in the anthropological literature, largely due to jealousy and economic and reproductive competition. Among the Luo in Kenya, for example, co-wives call each other nyeka, which means my partner in jealousy. And they are known to practice witchcraft and sorcery on one another. In Malaysia, Malay co-wives call each other by the word madu, which means honey. And this is almost like a mocking term to refer to a person who brings anything but sweetness to the marriage. Let me now turn to the village in Negeri Sembilan, where I conducted fieldwork on Malay polygamy and learned how sorcery came to be a crucial part of everyday life for some polygamous families. So the village where I conducted fieldwork is, I pointed it out in the white arrow here, which is in Negeri Sembilan. They are known to practice they are matrilineal people in Negeri Sembilan, which is very different from the rest of Malaysia. But nevertheless, the practice of polygamy is still prevalent in these areas despite matrilineality. So this picture is the house of the family where I lived with. It is so I lived in the house of the first family in this polygamous marriage. Who is represented is first wife, Makcik. Pakcik, her husband, has a second wife somewhere, and they have 3 children together. And the eldest daughter also married into polygamy as a second wife. And the husband of Karina, the eldest daughter, came from divorced parents, and his father remarried and had another family, but his mother married another man who then married another woman. So it was a very complex multi-generational polygamy, which was extremely interesting for me as an anthropologist. I felt like I hit the jackpot and just landed in the right family. So I will be focusing on the marriage of Makcik and Pakcik. as those were my main interlocutors for this in this paper. So Makcik had been married for around 10 years with Pakcik when she found out through a family friend that he had married another woman. In the 44 years that they had been co-wives, they had never encountered or communicated with each other face to face. And I myself never learned her co-wife's real name or what she was called by, because it was never mentioned in the house. Her co-wife, whom I will call Mak Nita, was at the time of my fieldwork around the same age as Makcik, who was in her early 70s when I was living with her. She was a divorcee when she married Pakcik and had reportedly been married 9 times prior to that. 9 times, Makcik told me dramatically with her fingers, as if to suggest and emphasize Mak Nita's questionable moral character, as indicated by her past as a serial polygamist. And even though divorce is allowed in Islamic law and also somewhat accepted in society, there is still some level of social stigma attached to it. So if you've been divorced 9 times, multiple that by 9 times. Over the past 40 years, many instances made Makcik suspicious that Mak Nita had been using charms on herself, using love magic on her husband, and sorcery on her and her family. Makcik heard from the sister of a neighbor in the same village, who often saw Mak Nita visiting the Dukun Sakai, who is an Aboriginal or indigenous sorcerer in her village in another part of Negeri Sembilan. First, Makcik was suspicious when Pakcik fell in love with Mak Nita and married her, given her multiply divorced past. She said that Pakcik was a good man and did not seem to be the type to fall so easily for such a woman. He had also been a responsible husband and father to her and their daughters, which soon changed after his remarriage. In her mind, Mak Nita must have used charms such as pemanis to make herself appear beautiful and charming to other men. She must have also used a kind of spell known as pengasih to make Pakcik fall in love and become infatuated with her. And second, Makcik was sure that she herself was targeted with sorcery known as pemisah. This means that a dukun or a sorcerer might have sent jinns or evil spirits to their house to make the atmosphere in the house unbearable and unlivable for Pakcik. And he would feel more inclined to go to his other wife's house. Makcik recalled in the early days of his polygamy of feeling hot and angry whenever Pakcik came near her. This made it difficult for them to connect physically, emotionally, and sexually. She said, if I sit next to him, he would get up and sit somewhere else. And being together in their conjugal bed felt even more unbearable. Then there were the strange behaviors and inexplicable illnesses. For years, Pakcik had suffered from a terrible cough for which the doctors could find no cure. Makcik thought that this was a sign that he had been fed with food contaminated by love potions and enchanted ingredients by his second wife, who wanted to make him her pak turut, which means like a yes man. And Makcik thought she achieved some measure of success. Sometimes in the middle of the night, in the pouring rain, Pakcik would hop on his motorcycle without leaving a word or taking his medicine or letting the family know where he would be, and he would ride directly to his second wife's house. And Makcik said he had been summoned by that woman. This, Makcik thought, may also be the reason why any extra money he might have acquired, most recently from an insurance payout due to a motorcycle accident that he had, always goes into Mak Nita's pocket, even though Makcik herself barely had enough to live on when she was raising their daughters. Makcik's daughters have also suffered greatly from Mak Nita's spiritual assaults, or their suspicions of spiritual assaults. All of them had difficulties finding a man to marry. And this, they suspect, is a result of a form of sorcery known as pelalau. This magic obscures a woman's desirability in the eyes of potential suitors by making her appear older and unkempt, and therefore, unattractive. However, married men seem to be particularly attracted to them. So, as one of their daughters said to me, if the man is unmarried, there would likely be many obstacles to the marriage, and the engagement would not happen. But if he's married, everything seems easy. Indeed, their eldest daughter ended up marrying as a second wife herself. More tragically, the second daughter suffered from breast cancer a few years after I had conducted fieldwork with the family. And they believe that this could also have been triggered by Mak Nita's sorcery as well. So to recap, there are different combinations of love magic and sorcery and supernatural powers at play. So first, Makcik thinks that the second wife had used pemanis to beautify her speech and appearance to attract men. And this comes from the word manis in Malay, which means sweet or to sweeten. And then the second wife, she suspects the second wife had also used pengasih to make the husband infatuated with her, and penunduk to submit him to her will. And pemisah was used on her, the first wife, to cause intense hatred between spouses and lose desire for sexual intimacy. And in the end, she believed that her daughters too targeted with a kind of sorcery known as pelalau, which is to make them appear undesirable to men and thus unmarriageable. And this comes from the Malay word lalau, which means to prevent something from happening. So there are different supernatural powers at play here, and I want to interpret these as a manifestation of intra-female violence. So according to the anthropologist Victoria Bergen, women do engage in physical aggression in 61% of the 137 cultures she studied, so in a survey study. And in the majority of these cases, the aggression seems to come from competition over males and sexual jealousy. Indeed, the literature from gender and co-evolutionary psychology seems to say something equally interesting about how intra-female violence occurs in the context of competing over men. There is Mavin Williams and Grandi have written about negative intragender relations, and they say that social processes, behaviors, and activities women engage in consciously or unconsciously when they subjugate, undermine, exclude, and stigmatize other women. And these are, we can see this in the practice of sorcery because they try to eliminate other female competition in the marriage. And then in female aggression, like women's aggression is likely to be principally concerned with scarce resources rather than with status, and it's likely to take low-key or indirect forms. And we can see sorcery as being kind of an aggression that is not done through direct confrontation. In fact, they use a sorcerer to send spells and jinns and spirits to cause harm to the other family. And usually, intra-female violence intensifies when good men are considered as a scarce resource. So Helen Fisher writes that competition does not end at mate acquisition. Once a good mate has been selected, he must be retained, almost at all costs. Sorcery as a manifestation of intra-female violence affects different aspects of the family. So first, it attacks the home, which is the physical space, the house, the conjugal bed, and it makes the spouses feel like they cannot live together anymore. And then sorcery attacks the hearth, which can see in the rupture of daily rituals that sustain everyday kinship relations. You know, when the father is not home, then they don't participate in these rituals of commensality together. And he is seen as someone who, like a visitor who comes from time to time, instead of a permanent member of the household. And it also attacks the heart in the sense that it results in redirected affections that affect economic equality and create jealousy between spouses. And I also want to consider the generational effects of sorcery, especially as an affront on Malay womanhood. So looking at the daughters from the polygynous family that I studied, you know, what they perceive as happening is that the sorcery attacks from the second wife causes mismarriage. Or due to trauma or aversion to marriage, children, especially daughters in polygamy, often delay marriage or choose celibacy. And this is something that was frequently mentioned in my interviews with the daughters. Like, you know, I see how married life is for my parents, and I don't want to get into that. So there's so much trauma that is still understudied, actually, but spoken of very frequently from children in polygamous marriages. And it also caused lost opportunities for motherhood. Sorcery can result in health problems that cause infertility or miscarriage. Delayed marriage also reduces chances of reproductive success. So in the polygamous family that I lived with, only 3 daughters that they had, they could only produce 1 grandchild because the daughters were, you know, marrying late or not marrying at all. And this relates, you know, it is almost like they perceive this as the second wife trying to attack things that would make them complete women in society, which is, you know, marriage, motherhood. Finally, we get to the conclusion. I want to end with some concluding thoughts. I suggest we should consider polygyny as not only one of the hot seats of patriarchy, but also as a site of rampant intra-female violence, which is often overlooked because it usually occurs behind the scenes through supernatural means such as sorcery and from a distance. And this is precisely why intra-female violence is particularly dangerous, because it is usually invisible to the naked eye and it remains underreported. Women who do try to report being targeted with sorcery are usually gaslighted and doubted by their spouse, family, and friends, who would say things like, "Oh, you're imagining things," or "the doctor has said you're not sick," or "that's just your jealousy talking." So they're not taken seriously when they report feeling like they have been targeted by sorcery. Second, I've shown that inter-female violence in polygyny is fostered by competition for scarce resources, especially the lack of time and money, and the husband's inability to distribute these and his affections in a reasonable way between his wives. And this provokes the need to monopolize access to these resources. As I've shown earlier, this is exacerbated by the lack of laws or legal framework to ensure that existing families don't fall into economic destitution after their husband's polygamy, which is usually often the case. Thirdly, through the lens of sorcery experiences in polygamy, I've demonstrated how patriarchy harms women on two levels. First, by creating the favorable social, legal, and religious framework, allowing unjust marital practices such as polygamy to flourish, leading to rampant neglect of women and children's economic and emotional well-being. And second, it pits women against one another and compels them to see each other as adversaries rather than as allies. And in this toxic environment, there is only room for competition, not a coalition between co-wives. But I also want to consider how women's practices of sorcery subverts the prevailing patriarchal structure in a way by putting men under women's spell, quite literally. Women are the ones dominating and monopolizing from behind the scenes, leading us to question who's actually the boss. Thank you.